I was really feeling emotional for Gaza, and I said, I'm just really feeling emotional for Gaza, and the situation in Gaza is really just tearing me apart. And she said, well, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help all those in need. And that is exactly like saying all lives matter, really. That's exactly like that. To actually say, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help all those in need when you're being told about Gaza, it's exactly like saying all lives matter because you're at that moment in that context, you're actually denying that their pain is at all real. And there are these groups that are backed up and literally paid by the government of Saudi Arabia to be exact, in order to spread lies. They're really Zionists, backed up by Zionists, really, to spread lies and make people believe that what's happening in Gaza is nothing but an exaggerated thing done by the Palestinians, and that no, it's not that big of a deal. And what happened was that Israel was retaliating to these terrorists, and this is really, to adopt the Israeli narrative and see it adopt that it is adopted by Muslims themselves and by which government, UAE and Saudi Arabia, just gets you so disgusted to see not that the government is adopting this, but to see that many Muslims are buying this is what is appalling. To see that many Muslims, and not only Muslims, but many will actually back it up by a religious narrative. And they'll give it that there's a religious reason, and they'll tell you, bring you up these names, and whether it's the madkhali shuyukh and all those different figures, and that are really, let's just call them, they're just really shuyukh sultan in order to bring about a religious seal. Literally, it's a religious seal for all the dictatorships out there, a religious seal. It's really Zionism, but you're putting a halal label on it, that it is approved by some sheikh. And it's really sad how we can have Muslims blinded to even recognize when such a pseudo scholar is really just so ignorant and unaware of all the schemes and all the agendas that are really handed down to these leaders and then handed down to these pseudo scholars to just put a halal seal on it. Literally, it's like a stamp right there on it, approved by God. That's exactly how the game is played. Approved by God. And what it is, it's like, oh, that's such uh, a tyranny from this leader. It's approved by God. And then therefore you would have these followers that are really Catholic in their approach, and even in the way that they would deal with these scholars, exactly the way that priests that or the Catholics would deal with their priests, and where it's approved by God. And they're so blinded to recognize, that this is not approved by God, but it's approved by Benjamin Netanyahu. It's approved by the Zionist movement. That's simply what it's approved by. It is extremely, yes, I'm laughing about it, but it's extremely appalling. It's extremely sad. And it's really important to recognize that if you don't yourself do the research, just by following some alim is not enough, because even alim can actually be a person that can deceive you. So you have to do your homework. And even alim, yes, somebody that is a scholar, somebody that is a scholar, somebody that might actually have a Sharia degree and might have a PhD in Sharia, etc. And we see it, and we had seen it even during our times. This was not simply that once upon a time such a thing happened. Even in the Quran, we're going to come across an ayah in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even in the Quran, tells us that there were times that the ones to delude and lead Bani Israel into really the punishment was really nobody but their own scholars and their own rabbis. In other words, those that had the ilm actually deluded them, and therefore they basically went into the punishment really led by their scholars. So it's extremely important to recognize that you have to get the ilm to make sure that you are letting the resources guide you to recognize who the alim al-Rabbani is. What is al-alim al-Rabbani? Having a alim is one thing, a scholar is one thing, and having a Rabbani is another thing. Because a Rabbani is simply a scholar that is not afraid to say the truth, is not afraid to go against the masses, is not afraid to say the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if that meant that they might lose publicity, might lose support, might lose followers, might lose perhaps the maybe the paying that he's getting from the government or whatever it is. They're willing to say the truth regardless. That's al-alim al-Rabbani. And those are important to recognize. They're not going to necessarily be the ones to have the highest followers, the ones that you will necessarily see all those shorts and all those reels and all those, microphones getting handed to them. They're usually those that are not as famous. And we have a lot of scholars that many don't recognize that they're actually great scholars. And I mean scholars at the highest level of scholarship, yet not many people are there benefiting from them. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ had also prophesied that at one of the signs of Judgment Day is that people will follow ru'usan juhala. They'll follow leaders that are really ignorant. They will have a certain religious appearance or might actually have a very eloquent speech, but then what their eloquent speech is empty of is really ilm. So really have to be really careful with that. All right, let's get to our tafsir, inshallah. أولئك الذين يعلم الله ما في قلوبهم. Of course, yesterday we went into so many different things and we talked about the munafiqeen, who the munafiqeen are, and we also talked about musibah, and we talked about evil, and we said that that not every single evil is necessarily as a result of what you committed, because evil would be in four different categories. Number one is the category where the Lord Almighty does not commit absolute evil, but there is, to you, you might actually see it evil, but it depends on, of course, it's a relative matter. It depends on the situation. And even if we are talking about natural disasters, the Lord Almighty will compensate that person. So if we were to judge it without having the complete picture of what's going to happen in that situation or to that person, even though they went through a certain struggle that is of considered probably natural disaster, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not commit and does not do absolute evil. It's that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, in your perspective, that's the end of the story. But the truth of the matter is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you that because of time and within time, the Lord Almighty will compensate, and there is still, the story is incomplete because there is the rest of the story is going to be completed on Judgment Day. All right, so the second part is absolute evil, and it can be attributed to people, absolute evil, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of course, determined that certain behaviors are absolute evil, and then we would go back to Quran and Sunnah to define what absolute evil is. Because when we speak about justice, it's not an issue of necessarily looking at the consequence, or you were doing what is called the universal imperative, or etc. So all these different philosophies, at the end of the day, we would go back to Quran and Sunnah, because that's the way to define justice for us, or to define morality. And it's not necessarily our own whims or our own feelings in regarding a particular matter. The other thing, we also talked about the part about evil, that not all evil is necessarily plain evil. So even when we're looking at the world around us, we may see, for example, our body going through certain pains, etc. We may think that that's absolute evil, when in reality, it is sometimes a doorway to bringing you good. And we talked about that piece of it. And of course, there's also the other part, which is that evil itself is actually a relative thing. What you might consider as evil, someone else might not consider evil. And of course, you cannot expect divine intervention every single time to you something evil is happening. And most important thing is that to remember that the reason why there is evil in the beginning is really because you are being tested. So without having the free will, you would not be tested, and it would make no sense to be tested if you're expecting a divine intervention each and every single time. And that's why there is nobility. If there wasn't any human intervention, or at least if we expected a divine intervention every single time something wrong was going to happen, then in that situation, we would definitely just rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have this divine intervention, and there would be no sense and no meaning to nobility, because we would then just rely on divine intervention each and every single time, and that would actually mean the end of being tested, because we would just sit down, just wait for God he'll figure it out, he'll make things work out, etc. And then we would basically do nothing. And that's where the one, nobility comes in, and two, of course, civilization, and three, that's where all good or any task comes in where you are capable of choosing to basically intervene, put in your courage, put in your patience, and despite all the pains, in order to save, in order to protect, in order to bring about a solution, in order to be the noble person. That actually comes with the center that you are held accountable, and plus the existence of good and evil. So this is extremely important. One of the important scholars, I would say, that probably did an outstanding job in discussing this. His name, he's not Muslim, but I think he did a couple good videos in that regards. And his name, oh boy, ya Allah, I forgot his name, just left my mind. Oh boy, I just left it. Oh boy, hold on. I'll get the name right now. Okay. He basically did a lot of hold on. William Lane Craig. So here we go. I'm just going to share just a little bit. I think he did an outstanding job in talking about that. His name is William Lane Craig. He did an outstanding job in discussing. I know I put here the Kalam argument, but there's also the theodicy. It's basically called the theodicy argument. I think he basically did a very good study, and of course speaking about the problem of evil and presenting it. Yes, he is not Muslim, and of course he will attack Islam a couple of times, but when it comes to discussing certain things, I think he doesn't recognize he doesn't recognize how similar Islam and even Christianity, at least on certain issues. I think this video, was it this video? Was it this video? Forgot. Yeah, so this is the guy that I was also doing dua for yesterday that you guys were wondering, who is that? It's basically this other guy, this guy, Jordan Peterson. Okay, this guy. All right. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give him hidayah. And at the end, we would make dua, just like the Prophet ﷺ had actually made dua for certain figures, even though they were at the time actually attacking Islam, but he made the dua for them to basically have their hearts changed to haqq. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have their hearts changed to haqq, whether it's William Lane Craig or I think the other person that I really, really want him to become Muslim. His name is, what is his name? Hold on, his name is John Lennox. John Lennox. Let me share John Lennox. He's a mathematician at Oxford, and he is such a calm person and does a very, very good job in refuting a lot of things on atheism. He does such an outstanding job. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Rabbi open his heart to Islam and give him hidayah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Ya Rabbi even lead the brothers there. I think the brothers in UK are doing an outstanding job. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Ya Rabbi give them all thabat and give them all the power. MashaAllah, doing an outstanding job in doing da'wah to Allah. Yes, he is. Jordan Peterson is definitely pro-Israel, or at least right now, definitely. So much against Islam. I know that. They know he was actually inviting a lot of those Islamophobes and heresy and all of those, and definitely, just right now targeting Islam. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala changes the hearts. Okay, let's continue right there. فكيف إذا أصابتهم مصيبة بما قدمت أيديهم. Of course, somebody might actually ask, what is this baby meme right there? This baby meme right there, whenever you would have a tanween, which is double tanween, double dhammas, or double kasras, or double fathas. This would be called tanween. Tanween means double. And if you were to have the letter ba after it, then in that situation, the N sound is going to be flipped into an M sound. And that is actually called iqlab. Iqlab means to flip. And sometimes you might actually have it. Let me see if I can find a page really quick. And sometimes you can actually have it at the end of a surah, all right? And you would be wondering, well, why is it there when in reality it's the end of a surah? All right, let's look at over here. عليهم نار مؤصدة. And you're like, where's the ba? And of course, the ba is the starting of the following surah. It's right there. Okay, so this is for you to just recognize what that meme is. All right, let's continue with our little tafsir right there, short tafsir. All right, let's continue. فكيف إذا أصابتهم مصيبة بما قدمت أيديهم. And of course, we went in details and said that al-musiba could be a test, could be to elevate and basically remove all the sins from the believer, even if that was a prophet. And it could also be where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is closing many doors on you in order for you to really just go towards the door of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, you're basically connecting yourself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rather to the many privileges that you might be so happy about that are pacifying you away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the other piece is that sometimes when we're speaking about calamities happening, some calamities can be a result of a person's behavior, a result of a person's sin. So it could be that it's coming at you. So in that situation, you always need to make the dua, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. And never make the dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would punish you in this life for a sin that you had committed. But instead, always make the dua, Ya Allah, bring us what is good in this life and what is good in the hereafter, and keep hellfire away from us. And of course, بما قدمت ثم جاءوك يحلفون بالله إن أردنا إلا إحسانا وتوفيقا. And of course, certainly, they would bring about a narrative, and this is always there, bring out, and you got to be really careful with this narrative piece of it, because with a narrative of, let's call a diabolical narrative, people will present themselves that they're actually trying to bring in good, they're trying to do what is right, they will speak about justice when they're the ones that are actually committing an injustice, they'll speak about being victims when they're the oppressors, they'll speak about bringing in and trying to bring a good contribution to the community when in reality they're actually the ones to bring about nothing but the opposite of bringing good. They are bringing in nothing but evil within the society. The Lord Almighty knows exactly what's in their heart. And that's why for a believer, you don't want to just look at their narrative and say, well, they're just trying to do what's right. No, you've got to go farther and actually see, yes, you won't be able to see the intention necessarily, but you have to look beyond the words in the narratives, and you got to make sure that you are, let's call it, testing, and you're using Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's paradigms in order to make sure that these people are really abiding by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's paradigms and not putting in a narrative in order to delude the masses. And certainly this is going to be a very scary thing that many will use. So got to be really careful with those narratives, because they can be a type of magic. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ actually said, Inna min al-bayani la sihra. From eloquence, there is this magic. There's this magic that can delude many. And of course, this quote, Inna min al-bayani la sihra, this was not at all to say that bayan or eloquence is necessarily evil or good, but there's one thing in where you really have to be careful in seeing people's way of wording as really the place of attraction for you, not because somebody might use some emotional speech, some speech that sounds very attractive, it doesn't necessarily mean that it contains ilm. Sometimes what it contains is really a way of manipulation. You really have to be careful with those words. And in order to not fall for such a manipulation, you really have to back yourself up with ilm. Ilm is your tool, is your way to be able to differentiate these murky areas that can be really hard to identify, because they become those gray areas. They're really close to the white, really close to the black, and you're really not able to differentiate those parameters, those lines. So therefore, what you really need to get is the tool of ilm to help you identify those borders, because those borders, they can be really, really, really tricky. So what I would really recommend, yes, it does feel good to listen to some lecture that's going into, I guess, taking us about in those different areas, to talk about therapy and spiritual therapy and all of that. That's important. I won't deny that. It really does elevate your deen and etc. But that's not enough. Sometimes, and in fact, to help you make sure that you're standing on the right grounds, you have to spend and teach yourself to basically be patient in talab al-ilm and sit in those areas, those durus, those classes that might actually seem boring, but they're actually giving you those foundations so that you would not confuse the path. It might seem boring to listen to the math of how we would identify those different paths and identify the red flags of whatever it is and where I'm supposed to be going, what I'm not supposed to be doing, etc. All these different things, they might actually sound so pragmatic, so boring. It might actually sound like it's basically just giving me more and more rules, more and more conditions, more and more things to look for, and not really giving me some emotional I guess elevation or emotional feelings and getting me spiritual in etc. and all of that, when in reality that is what is going to lead to one thing: أشد تثبيتا. It is going to be something that will keep you steadfast. If you want to actually have khair, you want to stay steadfast, you got to understand those roots. You got to understand those flags. You got to understand what it means to stay steadfast. You got to understand how to recognize the pathway to lead you to Jannah. All right, let's continue right there. And we're still, where were we? Yeah. Where was I? Yeah. Okay. أولئك الذين يعلم الله ما في قلوبهم فأعرض عنهم وعظهم وقل لهم في أنفسهم قولا بليغا. Let's see. So this ayah is basically telling us Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in their heart, or what's in their hearts, plural, since it's right there. So semicolon فأعرض عنهم, then stay away from them, since you had recognized that these people are really nothing but manipulators, are nothing but hypocrites. So now فأعرض عنهم, stay away from them. عظهم, but give them a good word to connect them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if you already had known that these people are hypocrites and that these people are nothing but manipulators, just continue reminding them and giving them a good word. وَقُلْ لَهُمْ فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ قَوْلًا بَلِيغًا, and tell them, and قُلْ لَهُمْ فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. I want you to look at this one because it says, and tell them deep in their hearts. That's a very horrible translation, but I'm just going to give you that surface translation. And tell them deep in their hearts words of complete eloquence. That was a horrible translation, but I'm just giving you the surface wording. So when you look at قُلْ لَهُمْ فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ, it didn't say قُلْ لَهُمْ قَوْلًا بَلِيغًا. It didn't say tell them eloquent words. No, it emphasized في أنفسهم, in their hearts or inside. In other words, you're not here talking to them, but make it this commitment that you're actually talking to their hearts and not talking to them. Because the second you personify something, then the person is going to be in a defense mode. So what you want to do is talk to the heart. And this is why that word fi anfusihim is there. Talk to the heart, because when you speak to the heart, then you're capable of probably keeping somewhere, some time, a word, a good word that might actually be a seed in their heart, to seed for good. And later on, this qawl baligh, this eloquent word, it's not necessarily eloquent. It's a word that carries with it eloquence, that carries with it logic, that carries with it basically an influential word to help the person basically find a beam of light to get them on track. So in other words, yes, we're telling you to turn your back away from them. We're telling you to leave them, but it's not to completely leave in where you're deserting this person, but you're keeping this line in where that line is in their heart, that they would remember that there is hope for me to come back. And this actually reminds me of how Prophet Musa alayhi salam how Prophet Musa alayhi salam was ordered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to go to Fir'aun, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him in Prophet Harun, فَقُولَ لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا لَعَلَّهُ يَتَذَكَّرُ أَوْ يَخْشَى. And where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him, and tell him kind words, give him kind words, فَقُولَ لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا لَعَلَّهُ يَتَذَكَّرُ أَوْ يَخْشَى. For that may be leading him for one, remembrance, or even yakhsha, or even have his heart soften to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already knows who Fir'aun is, already knows what his heart is, but still Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took it upon himself that he would not punish anybody till they actually get the complete reminder and the complete message before they're actually punished. All right. So a couple of things when we're actually looking at this I think it's important to go to the other piece of it, which is if we're talking about this ayah right there, of course, there's one part in where when it says فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ, you need to leave, you need to sometimes step back. And yes, you need to plant a seed of good within their heart. So the question is, me or you or the da'iya person. Who is the da'iya? The da'iya is basically the person that orders for what is good and forbids what is evil. How are they supposed to be behaving like? What are their descriptions? Now, this is important to mention because when we're speaking about the da'iya, it's important to recognize what we're supposed to be like and what this da'iya is supposed to be like before we would not recognize, if this ayah is telling us فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ, that might actually put us in a delusion, and we're thinking that, oh yeah, I'm just applying فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ, and we're turning our backs on everybody, when in reality, we're just living in arrogance. And we would create this narrative and say, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered me فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ, therefore I'm just, leaving all these people. And you can see it many times, people really telling you that, oh, the ayah tells me فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ, so I'm just leaving this person. And they find themselves really turning their backs on every single person and acting in complete arrogance, and they think they're applying the ayah. So before we go and interpret the ayah, I think it's important first to look at ourselves and see, well, what am I supposed to be like before? Because we did talk about the munafiqeen and what they're like. So the question is, what am I supposed to be like? What am I as a da'iyah supposed to be really acting in? So those are different areas. So I'll just go over with them really quick. So number one is that the da'iyah is supposed to have a deep connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's number one. Number two, a strong connection with people, although it sounds contradictory with the first one, but we're going to get there. Number three is actually have a wide understanding of ilm and wide understanding of Islamic knowledge. Number four is really know the people that they're calling to Islam. In other words, know them, know their lifestyle, know all these different things. We'll talk about it. Number five is actually have forbearance and forgive people when they transgress their limits, because they might feel offended by you actually calling out some of what they are engaging in and bringing them certainly some form of ecstasy. Number six is really not letting your words contradict your actions. In other words, you're not being a hypocrite yourself. Number seven is you yourself living in al-istiqama. What is al-istiqama? Al-istiqama is basically, remember when we read Surah Al-Fatiha, Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, that's exactly where it comes from. الاستقامة, المustaqim, it's actually the same root. And الاستقامة simply means that you yourself are living the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but not only living the words, but you are steadfast on them. And number 8, my favorite, is really being humble. Yes, it doesn't necessarily mean to be humble. It doesn't mean that you would become people's doormats, but we'll get there in just a bit. And number 9, certainly shaja'a, having the courage to say the word of truth and being steadfast despite all the different challenges that could actually come out at you right there for saying the word of truth. Number 10, even though it should have actually been number 1, but we'll just let it go, is basically ikhlas, sincerity. This was supposed to be number 1, sincerity. I'm going to talk about sabr as well, having patience. It doesn't necessarily mean by having patience that the pain is not there. In fact, the pain is going to be there. It's all about having patience in enduring the pain despite all the pain, but you're still holding on to the principle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And number 12, I love that, even though I don't always maybe do the best at it, which is being concerned about appearance. Okay. I don't always apply being concerned about appearance. That was me since I'm a little girl, but anyhow. All right. Let's start with the first one. So if we're talking about قوة الصلة بالله, having that strong connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and of course we would see it in the ayat. Now it's really important if you actually want to talk about having the descriptions for a da'iyah, it's important to recognize that you got to go back to Quran and Sunnah to help you recognize those descriptions, because you don't want to put in some descriptions that your own anecdotal anecdotal feelings about it. It's not an issue of having you and how you feel about it. It's an issue of what the Quran itself had actually recommended for you. Because remember, the Quran is always telling you the stories and even giving you those descriptions of the da'iyah, because number 1, the Quran would tell you these stories because it's telling you, well, that's how the story of da'wah and the mission of da'wah began. How do you continue the story? Can we have the links of these points? Oh, absolutely, sure. And here we go. So it's really important to recognize. Let's see what that ayah tells us to do. So yes, it's asking us to keep a strong relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because let's see, Inna Allah yudafu an alladhina amanu. Number 1 is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, just at that moment when you might be so concerned and you might actually be so deeply hurt because a lot of the attack is going to be at you as a person, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, don't get yourself too busy in trying to defend yourself, because defending yourself is really left on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the one that's going to be taking care of your protection. Inna Allah yudafi an alladhina amanu. So when people are attacking you, don't get yourself so busy with trying to defend yourself, but get yourself busy with defending Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He'll take care of bringing all the evidence or even protecting you. Well, this doesn't mean that you don't take your security seriously. It doesn't mean that, oh, I don't want to put any security measures. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of the matter. Well, al-mu'min is kayyisun fatan. A mu'min, a believer, is kayyis. Kayyis to mean that they're intelligent, they're smart, fatan, they're wise. You don't want to just leave everything. You take your measures, make sure that you are protected, make sure that everything is going in the right direction, and then you leave that tawakkul, you leave that dependence on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you put your trust on Allah, in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you leave the rest for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's see. The ayah says, وَلَقَدْ سَبَقَتْ كَلِمَتُنَا لِعِبَادِنَا الْمُرْسَلِينَ إِنَّهُمْ لَهُمُ الْمَنْصُورُونَ وَإِنَّ جُنْدَنَا لَهُمُ الْغَالِبُونَ. bringing in a final statement. And it has been decreed by a word that we had given to all our servants from the messengers, that they are the ones to be in victory, and that our soldiers are the ones to be in the highest level of victory. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَيَنْصُرَنَّ اللَّهُ مَن يَنْصُرُهُ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَقَوِيٌّ عَزِيزٌ. The Lord Almighty will basically give victory to those that give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala victory. Wait a minute. I'm going to give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala victory so he can give me victory. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling you that if you are the one to basically be there in the mission and really carrying on the Prophet's emblem, the Prophet's mission, that the Lord Almighty would be the one, as he had given the promise and decree before, that he would give victory to those that would give the Lord Almighty victory, to those that would support and stand for the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is qawiyyun aziz. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most mighty and aziz. I want to look at the word aziz here, because when you look at Mayyan Surah, some people will actually think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in need of us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need of us. We are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is emphasizing. So you will not misunderstand Mayyan Surah and think, oh, Allah's in need of us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically giving you an opportunity to carry on the mission, to get others close to him, others run to him. And that's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that he's not in need of your victory. He's capable of giving victory to his word, even if you decide to back off. Because at the end of the day is that the Lord Almighty, he is the creator, and he's capable of creating all people with a good heart, and capable of creating all people act like angels. But he wanted, remember that part about that ayah when we were talking about nobility? He's giving the people the chance to carry that level of nobility by actually carrying the mission of the prophets and the messengers. And in situations where certainly we can probably go in some form of anxiety, some kind of some sort of sadness when we're doing the da'wah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَيْأَسُوا مِنْ رَوْحِ اللَّهِ إِنَّهُ لَا يَيْأَسُ مِنْ رَوْحِ اللَّهِ إِلَّا الْقَوْمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. And do not, because it is not befit, certainly, for a believer to lose hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If they were to lose hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the only ones to lose hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are really al-kafirun, are really the disbelievers. Why? Because for a believer, they would recognize that there's no way that evil will prevail. There is no way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to let go of those that carried on the mission that he had asked the prophets to deliver. So in that situation, it's important to recognize that when you would go into moments of sadness and moments of sorrow because of probably an attack and etc. In that situation, it's important to recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, the Prophet ﷺ did actually go through situations where he himself was completely sad. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was also telling the Prophet ﷺ in where he was telling him that فَلَعَلَّكَ بَاخِعٌ نَفْسَكَ عَلَى آثَارِهِمْ. Are you here becoming over in complete anxiety and over in you're over or displaying extreme sorrow and sadness because they're basically backing off from the religion? And exactly like that moment in where the Prophet ﷺ, when he goes to a Ta'if, so here he is, he was persecuted in Mecca, and then he starts looking for a safe haven, really, in order to practice Islam, in order to deliver the message, and in order to continue the mission. So he starts going from one city to another, but then the city of Ta'if reacted in a very fearful response, with a very fearful response, in where they let their children loose in order to stone the Prophet ﷺ, literally to stone the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ, Zayd ibn Thabit or Zayd ibn Haritha, and not Zayd ibn Thabit, but Zayd ibn Haritha was with the Prophet ﷺ, who's actually his adopted son, or at the time, adopted son. And he was trying to protect the Prophet ﷺ, but still the Prophet ﷺ was definitely still touched and still hurt and still was stoned with these stones. And it still did actually get him to bleed. He was sitting on the side after managing to somehow escape these children that the thought if people had let loose on the Prophet ﷺ, and he started making the dua. Allahumma ilayka ashku da'fa quwwati وقلة حيلتي وهواني على الناس أنت رب المستضعفين وأنت ربي إلى من تكلني إلى بعيد يتجهمني أم إلى عدو ملكته أمري إن لم يكن بك علي غضب فلا أبالي ولكن عافيتك هي أوسع لي. I want you to look at here. In where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, O Lord Almighty, I come complaining the weakness of my power and my inability, or at least the weakness of my power and the different, basically the inabilities, the weakness of my abilities and the inabilities that are right now I'm portraying, and how I'd become vulnerable to the people. You are the Lord of the weak, and you are my Lord. Who would you leave me to? For somebody that is distant to transgress the limits with me, or or to an enemy that you had given power over me. If you are angry at me, well, I basically would not mind all of this as a result. But I know that your dismissal and your forgiveness is wider space for me. Now, here's the thing. This is actually one of my favorite du'as because it's taking in a moment to recognize, and it's speaking your feelings rather than letting the feelings eat you up. You're letting your feelings, you're complaining to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It reminds me of in Surah Yusuf, in where, of course, the Prophet, إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. I complain my sorrow, I complain my sadness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, instead of letting your sorrow, your anxiety eat you up and, let's say, deplete your energy, you're letting it strengthen your energy, empower you differently, not empower you only towards the mission, but also empower you to reaching up to the Lord Almighty at that moment. In other words, it's a number of different directions. It's empowering you spiritually to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's also empowering you that you're connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to get you stronger in carrying out the mission rather than weaken and start living in this bubble that it's not working out. People are rejecting me. People are basically accusing me of so many different things. And here's one thing, is that when we're doing da'wah, there will be many attempts to test you. Number one, many will accuse your intention, but it can happen that you too might actually go to a moment where you would start doubting your intention. Are they right? You know, so many times in Arabic, or at least in the Palestinian accent, we actually say a gunshot, even if it doesn't hit the target, it would still deafen your ears. And that's true. Even if it doesn't hit the target, its blasting sounds would still deafen your ears. It would still harm you because the sound it's still going to somehow attack your ability to bring about a sense of the reality around you. And you start deafening your ears, and it will deafen your ears, and you will start really not be capable of hearing the true sounds that are worth hearing. And that is real. When these sounds, they will come at you trying to accuse your intention that you're trying to do something, you're trying to gain dunya, you're not doing exactly what you claim to say, etc. All these different things, it will make many slow down in their activity, in their actions, in the amount of contribution, in their da'wah. It will make them slow down because they too will start getting their ears, let's say, that deafening sound come into them. And it's exactly like how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even talked about the mu'min, that sometimes وَفِيكُمْ سَمَّعُونَ لَهُم, and some of you would actually listen to them without them wanting to, but it will start influencing them. So in that situation, what should I do? Hold on to your sincerity. Hold on to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Work on your spirituality. Don't stop your da'wah even when such words are at you. Because if you're doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you will see that that's an enough motive. It's an enough motive to have that I'm doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, despite all the negative arguments out there. That should not change. And that's why the Salihin and the scholars had defined al-ikhlas. They said it is istiwa ul-madhi wa dham. It is al-ikhlas, sincerity, is basically when praise and all these condescending comments to you mean nothing. They don't alter your mission. They don't alter what you are doing. They don't slow you down. They don't affect you. Whether somebody is praising you, you're doing a good job, hey, you're getting great followers, people are listening, it doesn't change anything. To you, you're still going to do the same thing because you recognize that it's not people's praise that is going to get you to Jannah, but it's really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's acceptance that's going to make a difference. You recognize that part. So you recognize that the praise, it doesn't really mean anything. It's of no value. At the same time, all the put downs, if we are to shift and actually say, well, you're not getting acceptance, people are turning their backs on you, etc. If you're going to be stopping, then that actually meant you were really seeking people to praise you. It can happen that shaitan will tell you, oh, you were just seeking praise. Oh, you were this. Oh, look at you. Oh, you can have shaitan tell you that, and you can doubt yourself at moments. But if you were to stop, then in that situation, you would actually be affirming exactly what you were basically having the thoughts tell you. So what should I do? Continue and don't stop, because that will bring about al-ikhlas. Al-ikhlas and sincerity is really when to you all the derogatory words and all the condescending comments and all those praises mean nothing to you. They don't change you and how you relate with the mission, because you recognize that it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you are concerned about and not people. Let's go for point number 2. The relationship that you would have with people. Now, it's important to actually have a good relationship with the people, because at the end of the day, you are basically here trying to bring about the people to come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the da'iyah, that is their mission. But in order to recognize this relationship, number one, certainly having that tawadu, or having that humility and being humble is extremely important. Because without you recognizing when you're not humble, you're basically going to be having that exaggerated ego. And the second that you would have that ego, remember, Iblis was the first one that actually said, Ana khayrun min. I'm better than he is. I'm better than him. I am better. Therefore, I should be the one that they would make sujood for me, that he would make sujood for me. I'm better. What? How are you better? He said, خلقتني خلقته من طين and خلقتني من نار. Basically, he saw himself as being better or somehow being at a higher status because he saw that, well, you created me from nar, from something that brings energy. In other words, I have more potentials than what he has. He's created from clean. He doesn't have the same potentials. And of course, he didn't understand that, hey, when you look at the minerals, and even I guess he really would fail at a physics class, the minerals in soil is actually a lot more than the minerals inside the fire. But you would definitely fear it. And in other words, even if you were to talk about energy, even if you were to talk about potentials, soil actually has more than that. But he was such a very shallow in his understanding, where he actually thought, well, I'm actually better. I would have a better potential. I'm stronger, because he thought that fire was a lot stronger. And this is really important, that many times people will create this ana, create this ego, and see themselves as better than others simply because they might focus and exaggerate the focus on their potentials, on the different privileges that they might have, and think that that is a reasonable reason to why they would have the right to get the privileges, have the right to actually get some advantage, and therefore they would get to the conclusion, well, if I had that privilege in this life, therefore I should have the privilege in the hereafter too. So, and then they would basically explain that, well, I only got the privilege because I deserve it, because I am simply having either the potential of intelligence, or probably because I deserve it because I'm of a better nature. And this basically leads to arrogance. And arrogance and takabbur, the Prophet ﷺ actually said, no one with a dharra min kibr, even if it is a small iota of pride or arrogance, will enter Jannah. None will enter Jannah if they were to have such arrogance. So, in order to remove such arrogance, it's important to have a relationship with people. Talk to the poor, talk to those that don't necessarily come from the privileges that you probably grew up in. Talk to those, even they're uneducated, and recognize that you might find that there are those that are probably not carrying the degrees that are actually wiser than you. You will find those that might not have that money actually have something more valuable than your money, which is akhlaq, or probably something else even more valuable, because true wealth is not the money, but true wealth is actually the wealth of happiness, the wealth of confidence, the wealth of strength, the wealth of akhlaq. That is the most valuable thing that you can actually have, and not the money. The money was granted to you, was given to you from the rizq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there are lots of things that you might have actually lost, even though you had the money. But these people might actually have the most beautiful soul, the most beautiful heart, and you might actually be so focused on materialistic things when you were so blinded to recognize that there was something else more valuable than what you have that they have. Same thing. If you were to think that your race is somehow better, etc., well, even if your race was Qurashi, remember Abu Lahab was Qurashi too. Was actually the Prophet's uncle. Just because you are considered within a particular society to somehow being considered the noble person, the noble group, etc., recognize the Prophet said, "Ya Fatima, ittaqillah fa inni la ughni laki min Allah shay'a." Oh Fatima, have taqwa, because I will not be capable of standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when you stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I will not be capable of defending you before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the Prophet telling Sayyidah Fatima. The Prophet had told Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, when Abu Dharr had told Bilal ibn Rabah, he told him, Yabna Sauda, when he told him, you are the son of a black woman. The Prophet ﷺ got so furious and he said, Jahiliya wa ana bayna dhahranikum. Is this a Jahiliya? Jahiliya when I'm still amongst you, yet you embrace considering that somehow your biological race or your status or somehow your blood is what actually makes somebody of a higher status than the other, and not necessarily based on the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nasu inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل تعارفوا, in where إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. Verily, the one to be in the highest level, the one to be the most honorable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically the one with the highest deen, with the highest righteousness, with piety. That's what makes a person actually be considered as a person that is elevated or beyond someone else. Now, to have that relationship with people, it's important to remove the arrogance, and it's definitely important to actually study even the situation that people are living in. We're going to get to that, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even when the Prophet ﷺ, he himself, when he wanted to do dawah, and of course, he was doing dawah to whom? He was doing dawah to certain chieftains and leaders in Quraysh. And these chieftains and leaders in Quraysh, the Prophet ﷺ was talking to them, but who was actually approaching to ask questions at that moment? It was simply a blind man, and this blind man was Abdullah ibn Maktoum. I want to look at his name and memorize Abdullah ibn Maktoum. He was actually one of the Sahaba that went with Mus'ab ibn Umair to Medina. And Abdullah ibn Maktoum, whenever you look at Abdullah ibn Maktoum, you got to remember Surah Abasa. The Prophet ﷺ, when Abdullah ibn Maktoum was asking these questions, the Prophet ﷺ was really busy engaging in dawah with important figures, officials, chieftains of Quraysh, where the community would regard them of a higher status. And if any of these people were to become Muslim, it would definitely be a great asset to the community, to the Muslim community, because this would empower the Muslim community. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually, I don't want to use the word scolded, but disciplined the Prophet ﷺ and said, Abasa wa tawalla. The Prophet ﷺ was definitely giving some kind of a frown. This frown when Abdullah ibn Maktoum was constantly asking the question about tazkiyah, about getting better to become Muslim, become more spiritual, etc. But he was already busy with someone else and with all these people, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you frowned and you turned away. When the blind man had come to you, and you never know, he might actually get into a higher level of a spirituality or a purification, or even to get a reminder, and it would benefit him more. As for the person that had disregarded him, فَأَنْتَ لَهُ تَصَدَّى, you basically turned him away. وَمَا عَلَيْكَ أَلَّا يَزَّكَّى وَأَمَّا مَنْ جَاءَكَ يَسْعَى وَهُوَ يَخْشَى فَأَنْتَ عَنْهُ تَلَهَى. And for the person that had come with full potential, full power to come to you, and they were seeking, they were coming in with their hearts actually soft. You had turned away and you were pacified away from them. And I want to look at this ayah because it can happen where we might be focused on certain figures or certain people and consider that they would be a better asset, and we're so pacified away from those that are probably considered as of a lesser class in the community. How do I learn how to سلم على من عرفت ومن لم تعرف. The Prophet ﷺ said, shake hands and say Assalamu alaikum and spread peace to those that you know and those that you don't know. When you're going into Salat al-Tarawih, tap the person in front of you. I'd like to know where you're coming from. I'd like to know who you are. Can you tell me your name? Give a nice gesture. Get to know the people around you. You're seeing a person, whether it's a Muslim or a non-Muslim, get to know them, spread out peace, learn how to reach out to people. And that's the way to actually be a da'iyah. Don't be reserved to yourself where I don't want to talk to people and oh, I'm an introvert. No, this is what you had determined about yourself. You can be and train yourself how to be not necessarily completely extroverted, but learn that to engage in such dawah, to train yourself how to reach out is actually an honor. It's an honor. Don't convince yourself, oh, I'm an introvert, therefore I can't talk to people. Oh, I'm actually like that. No, this is something that you convinced yourself with. You can train yourself to be a person that can reach out, a person that can be talking, a person that can engage in conversations with people. You convinced yourself into that. And of course, now you have all these different people actually convincing you into, yes, you're introverted, therefore you have to stay like that. This doesn't mean that we have to live in such labels. These things we can train ourselves to become certain figures. These things can also be acquired. This is important to keep in mind. These things can be acquired if we put ourselves in the right environment, if we pushed ourselves to the limit. You push yourselves to the limit and you will see yourself adapting to a new personality, to a new person. It doesn't mean that if somebody classified you in a certain way, it doesn't mean that you're imprisoned and you have no choice to change. You have no ability to change. You've got the ability. If you didn't have the ability to change, then it would make no sense to actually tell you in the Quran or in the Sunnah to engage in certain behaviors, to do certain things. It would make no sense, because then, well, we would know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed me that way, therefore I have no choice. Why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ask me to change into something else when I would have no choice? It makes no sense. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually given you certain things to adapt to, certain behaviors to adapt to basically grow, to train yourself into, because that is the goal of how you could actually become really mimicking a da'iyah, mimicking a prophet, mimicking as-siddiqeen, al-shuhada, and mimicking as-salihin. The other thing, in order to actually be, and of course, when you deal with people, it can be a tricky slope, because when you're dealing with people and you get yourself into, I guess, this area of socialization, you can find yourself relating and connecting with people that are probably I would say very what should I say, tricky areas. They could be people of misconceptions, they could be people of shahawat, they could be people of different lusts, they could be people that might, instead of you pulling them to the dawah, they might actually pull you instead. So you really have to be careful in how you reach out and where you reach out and to whom you reach out to. in order to be able to be at that level in where you are basically protecting yourself from this slippery slope. You've got a rope that you hang on to with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is the rope of al-ilm. That's the rope of al-Quran. That's the rope of al-ilm, to make sure that whenever you're feeling like you're gonna fall, you've got this rope to hold you back, where you can go back up again whenever you're feeling that, oops, this was too slippery. I didn't think that this was going to be that dangerous. That's why, look at this. The Prophet ﷺ, when he sent Mu'adh, now Mu'adh ibn Jabal is basically right there on a mission, and he was in his early 30s. Okay, early 30s. I like looking at the Sahaba's ages because it's important. I do care about age a lot, because I do see through age. It's not just a number, but it actually carries a lot of history in it and a lot of experience. So I always like to look at their age to see exactly, so what was happening? What was he capable of doing? And of course, why did the Prophet ﷺ choose him? So he was in his early 30s. And well, he sent Mus'ab ibn Umayr when he was only a teenager. Mind you, Mus'ab ibn Umayr, when he sent him to Medina, he was only almost 16 years old. He was just a young teenager. And it's important to look at these milestones in where, when I'm raising as a parent my child, what is the milestone that he can get up to? How far can he go? Is he capable of doing such missions? Can he or she do such and carry such missions or not? I think within our society right now, we're underestimating our children's potentials, that many times we're making them really live like children and react like children. And that is actually problematic, because what we're seeing is that when it is time for them to grow out of this children's cycle and then out of this children's circle, they're right there falling at the first challenge in their life, and they're already going to depression and gaming and all of that. And you're like, well, of course, you had the potentials of an adult in your reproductive system in certain behaviors, but then you were acting like a child when it came to the other potentials. Why? Well, because certainly we did not enhance their potentials to be to the age of maturity and to handle the responsibilities like a grown adult. Let's say the Prophet ﷺ, let's go back to Mu'adh. Mu'adh, the Prophet ﷺ sends him to Yemen. And of course, Yemen was not necessarily all Muslim. Certainly, some people were struggling with their Islam. Certainly, there was another figure that was actually called al-Aswad al-Ansi. And this man was dressed up in black, and he was covering all his face in order to seem like this hidden figure. And Al-Aswad al-Ansi was claiming to be a prophet. He was exactly acting like a Dajjal. Anyhow, so the Prophet ﷺ sent Mu'adh, and he asked him a couple questions. I want to look at these questions because they are questions to teach us what to look into. Remember the rope. When you want to deal with people, so here we go, he's sending him, and now he's going to be dealing with people. He's going to be encountering so many different cases, so many different circumstances. And certainly he doesn't have no WhatsApp. He doesn't have no Telegram. How can I correspond with the Prophet ﷺ? He's basically miles and miles and hundreds of miles away. And even if he basically wanted to send a note to the Prophet ﷺ, it would probably be already too late to get to the Prophet ﷺ, because it's going to be almost 2 months till it would get there, and 2 months until the message would probably come back. It would take a very long time. So the Prophet ﷺ tells him, كيف تقضي إذا عرض لك قضاء? How would you rule if you had a trial come to you? And he said, I would rule by the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet ﷺ said, And what if you don't find something in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? In other words, you don't find your answer in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He responded, well, by the sunnah, by the tradition of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And he said, even what if you don't find anything in the tradition of the Prophet, peace be upon him? And he said, I would make my judgment without putting in any lack of effort. The Prophet ﷺ struck on his chest and he said, Alhamdulillah alladhi waffaqa Rasulullah Rasulillah lima yurdi Rasulallah. Alhamdulillah, all the praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he had made him successful to have the Prophet's messenger, have a messenger to apply what the messenger himself was content of. And that's as important. If you look at this one, so in order to hold on to that rope that keeps you from slipping down when being in a position of da'wah, it's important to learn the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, important to learn the sunnah. But right now, should I just, sit in a corner and start learning the book by yourself or by myself, or learning the sunnah, get Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and start reading it? Well, that's not enough, because you're not equipped with the Lugha Arabiya, or even if you're a master in Lugha Arabiya or a PhD in Lugha Arabiya, it's not enough to have Arabic language. But you really have to also know the history of Islamic studies, the history of the text, the history of the hadith, the history of the Quran, etc., the reason why certain ayat were revealed, etc. And that's why they basically made it easy for you by teaching you and putting it in the books of tafsir, in the books of exegesis, in the books of hadith, in the books of fiqh, etc., to make the story easy for you. So right there, this is just basically telling you that holding on to the rope of Quran, Sunnah, etc., and Islamic studies, and then of course, right there, then you would basically, you might say, well, I'll just do ijtihad like he has done. All right, like he had done. All right, al-ijtihad would not be unless you would recognize that he would go back to the references. So just be careful with that. Now, the other thing is basically to know the people that you're doing da'wah to, know their language, know their history, know their culture, know their civilization, their, all the different things that relate to them. Because when you know their history and you know the different things in their culture and know the religions out there and even know their psychology, have some knowledge about their language and all of that, it's actually important to keep a relationship with them. Because when a person feels that you're foreign onto them, that would just shut down. That would just shut down, and then they're ready to feel that this person doesn't understand me, this person is not related to me. And that's why, you could see an explanation of many dua were really successful. I think one main reason was really because they mastered to speak to their mindset, they mastered to speak to their psychology, they mastered to speak to their mindset is extremely important, and of course all of those different things. And that's why, alhamdulillah, we could see right now really I would say an increase in the number of dua, an increase in the number of those that are reaching out to the young. And I was really surprised, to be honest, when I had seen many young boys, young teenagers, actually fascinated with Muhammad hijab. And you know what? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep him steadfast. I was really surprised to actually see many young boys. They're really infatuated, let's say it that way, with Muhammad hijab. And mashallah, to actually connect onto someone that is trying to be proud of Islam. And of course, I don't want to praise somebody that is living today because you never know what fitna they might go through. But I think it's important to recognize even the efforts that the younger generation, or at least, yes, he's probably in his early 30s now, but younger generation, alhamdulillah, is right now finding leaders, finding good sources, resources, and finding good examples to mimic, to of course find in them this pride in Islam. This pride in Islam. I think it's important. Let's say Zayd ibn Thabit. Zayd ibn Thabit basically had mastered the Syriac language. Although the Syriac language, it's important to mention, Syriac language is a Semitic language, so there are a lot of words, and there's a lot of comparison between Syriac, Hebrew, and even Arabic. But the Prophet ﷺ basically gave Zayd ibn Thabit, he told him that he gave him the order to learn Syriac because the Prophet ﷺ was getting a lot of notes that were coming in Syriac. So here, Zayd ibn Thabit took it upon himself and learned Syriac in 17 days. Now, that is exceptional. But that's in order to tell us that Zayd ibn Thabit, who at the time was a teenager, that the Prophet ﷺ recognized that there are young teenagers. In fact, there is a hadith, although not authentic. It basically says, Nusirtu bishabab. It's not authentic, but it really, in practice, it was actually true. That the Prophet ﷺ said, the ones to give me victory, the ones to support me were really the youth, the younger generation. They were the ones to actually give Islam the biggest advancement, the biggest victory. And it's actually quite true. When you look at the young Sahaba, they were the ones to bring in a lot of power, a lot of confidence, and a lot of courage, and certainly a lot of ilm and contribution, in where you could see Zayd ibn Thabit, only 17 years old, but he learned and mastered a whole language in 17 days. So, in other words, we should actually be using the different potentials, perhaps in computer science, probably in making games, in making all these, in making, all those potentials, even for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, making apps or whatever it is. We're seeing the younger generation, many times Gen Z, for example, right now, Gen Z is basically the ones that are actually bringing in the pro-Palestine on social media. And that's really petrifying Israel. It's really petrifying Israel because they didn't expect that. I guess they were so focused on the older generation that the younger generation just blew them off to basically be slipped out of their area. They didn't expect that social media was going to be at their hands so much that they got access to a lot of that information that they couldn't control. And therefore, you actually had seen that it's the younger generation right now that's becoming Muslim in larger numbers, the younger generation that's actually being active. And hopefully, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring in hidayah for the younger generation. All right, let's see the other part. Al-hilm wal-afu. Of course, you could say, yes, you will be dealing with people, but of course, some of it is not necessarily just holding on to the rope of Islam, but you're going to be yourself attacked in many ways. Let's say, al-hilm wal-afu, forbearance and forgiving. Well, al-afu is, yeah, forgiving, is it? Yeah, somewhat. So the Prophet ﷺ, this Ashaj Abdul Qais, Ashaj ibn Ashaj Abdul Qais. So the Prophet ﷺ praises him, and I want you to look at this one. Okay. Al-Mundhir ibn al-Ashaj ibn Qais. This is actually more accurate than the way that they actually named him. Anyhow, so listen to this. I want to focus. This is one of my favorite hadith. Okay. So he and his tribe were coming from outside. In other words, they were an outside tribe. They come in Medina. The Prophet ﷺ was sitting with the Sahaba. Yet al-Mundhir doesn't come directly to the Prophet ﷺ. He basically goes, and it seems like there was a public bathroom or I don't know, public shower. I'm not sure how they would do it, but he goes, takes a shower, dresses up, puts perfume on, and then goes to meet the Prophet ﷺ, even though the rest of the group went to meet the Prophet ﷺ right away. But the Prophet ﷺ tells him, Inna fika خلتين or خصلتين. There is another hadith, خصلتين. يحبهم الله الحلم والأناة. So this is خلتين. يحبهم الله الحلم والأناة. You have two descriptions, or there is another narration. إن فيك خصلتين. خصلتين يحبهم الله ورسوله. That you have two descriptions that Allah and His Messenger love in you. And he asked what they were, and he said, al-hilm wal-ana. Al-hilm is forbearance. In other words, when you are harmed, you don't retaliate and you give in, that is. You are basically forbearant. Wal-ana. Al-ana is that you don't rush. You're not impulsive. You don't rush. You take things bit by bit and you are patient, basically, within that. Now, here's one thing. One very important question is that al-Mundhir ibn Ashaj bin Qais, he actually asked a serious question. He said, أخلقين تخلقت بهما أم جبلني الله عليهما. Are they descriptions that I disciplined myself into, or are they descriptions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in me? And he said, بَلْ جَبَلَكَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمَا. As a matter of fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created them in you. And he responded, Alhamdulillah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created two descriptions that Allah and His Messenger love in me. And I want to look into this. In other words, when you have an attitude, or at least a certain, let's call it a certain description that you just love about yourself. Maybe you're outgoing, maybe you're just a happy person, maybe you just are always, forgiving, maybe you're just loved by people, maybe you're eloquent. It is not necessarily because you just knew how to get to the wild card of doing things the right way. It's basically because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put something in your DNA without you realizing, and that was a potential that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. So this potential, whether what it meant a potential of a certain behavior or a certain psychology, a certain attitude, whatever it is, all of those are actually God-given. So in other words, it's actually right there in your DNA. And therefore, so the question is, if this is part of my DNA, then I can't help it. I'm introverted and I can't help it, and therefore I'm all done. Well, not quite. Because although, yes, this person, the Prophet ﷺ, did tell him that it is part of his DNA, but that doesn't mean that we cannot unlearn or learn new things. Perhaps we wouldn't be as masters as others, because some people, because of their DNA, they are just excellent at it. For example, you could learn physics, but somebody, and definitely other people, can definitely be just a complete brain with just wired for physics. This is real. You will have somebody where their brain is just so wired to learning medicine, physics, chemistry, whatever it is, engineering, languages, etc. And you will see that how did they do it? Why? So, yes, there are certain things that you can be wired to be masters at, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that you can not learn certain things that others are masters at. So therefore, you could see that even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was ordering the Prophet and tells him, وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. If you were hard-hearted, then people would have just repelled away from you. So what should I do? How can I actually implement this? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, he tells him, well, don't be hard-hearted, which is a metaphor. This is not talking about some kind of a cardiovascular thing. No, this is not talking about that. This is actually talking about a metaphor where you are feeling with others' pains, where you are letting people recognize that you feel with them. In other words, that's what it means to not be hard-hearted. Not hard-hearted. Yes, having the relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is important, but it's also having the relationship and feeling empathy, having that empathy with people, with their pains, with their circumstances, all of that. So in situations where people might take advantage of my empathy, of my kindness, what should I do? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, خُذِ الْعَفْوَ وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ. This is key. We'll leave it with this point, inshallah. خُذِ الْعَفْوَ. 3 orders. Take the good. When you would get a kind gesture, a good word, embrace it, appreciate them for it, thank them for it. خُذِ الْعَفْوَ وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ. In order for what is good. In other words, not because somebody is giving you a kind gesture that you would just leave it at that and just be thankful. No, you also, on the other hand, need to be strong, need to be firm. وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ. Order for what is good. Within an order, it's an imperative verb, which actually means you have to have some form of a commandment, some form of an order, some form of firmness to order for what is good. It doesn't mean that you're just lenient all the time, that you actually have to be. Yes, take the good gesture, but at the same time, be strong in facing all those different negative things that are out there in order for what is good. Make a strong commandment, make a strong personality that helps others identify the boundaries, identify the borders. وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ. And certainly turn your backs away from jahilin, because they might take advantage and they might try to trespass the boundaries. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, those jahilin, those that might actually start attacking you personally, a'rad, which is really similar to what this ayah was telling us to do right there, and telling us فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ. أَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ. Turn away. Don't necessarily get yourself absorbed into their area that they had mastered. What did they master? Well, they mastered all the dirty work. They mastered the dirty lifestyle. They mastered the dirty games. Be careful from getting absorbed and getting pulled into their area of being dirty. What do I have to do? Get out of that politics of it. Get out of that dirty pond and that dirty area. In other words, when If you were to be pulled by those pigs inside their mud puddle, guess what? You're not going to be better at it. They have been mastering swimming in those mud puddles. Don't get pulled into those mud puddles. What should I do if they're practicing jahiliyyah? Don't practice it with them. If you think that, oh, it's in defense of haqq, no. You're putting yourself, you're getting absorbed into their lifestyle. Never put yourself into those corners. What should I do? Get out of that jahiliyyah. Don't get absorbed in it. You'll see on social media people talking against that scholar and against that da'iyah and against that shaykh or against that shaykh, and etc. And the second you see yourself be getting absorbed in that mud puddle, you're going to see those that have the ilm and those that don't have the ilm engaging in such talk. And the social media had actually given those that are ignorant the same platform as those that are scholars. And some people, some people with their ignorance, with their jahiliyyah, just by having a platform, they would actually think that they are at the same level of those that actually have ilm. Don't put yourself where others will start targeting you and put yourself in their mud puddle. Social media could actually be a very dangerous area where you will be finding yourself in nothing but a mud puddle of jahilin. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, أعرض عن الجاهلين. Turn away. You have to learn when to turn away and when to approach. You have to be, that's an expert da'iyah. When to put forward, when to come forward, and when to pull out. When you would see the jahiliyyah being the place where everyone is jumping in, that's where you don't want to be in. So where should I go? Go to the areas where you would find ilm, to the areas where you would find people engaging in bringing in a better elevation to their hearts. Go to those areas where you would grow in your contribution for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and for the ummah, and not necessarily in those that criticize easily. There are many out there. If it's a alim, they'll easily be criticizing. If it's a contribution, they'll easily be criticizing left and right. Oh, they're just going into this activity. It's not going to do anything to the ummah. And they'll be criticizing left and right. This is to them their contribution. Basically, just negative talk, pulling people back from any activity. And to them, they're the ones that are doing the activity. Some people, they think that their job is to demolish every single person's building. And they think that by demolishing such buildings, that they're actually bringing in the contribution. The best contribution that you could bring sometimes is actually the appreciation for the contribution that others are trying to do. Sincerity. Sometimes the best way is to stay silent. Say what is good. من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليقل خيرا أو ليصمت. Whoever believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Judgment Day, say what is good or stay silent. If you don't know how to make da'wah, then at least don't bring negative comments to those that are trying to do what is good. That's the least that you could do, is to at least bring in, if you don't know how to make the da'wah, at least spend time for talab al-ilm. At least spend time to educate your children, educate your family, instead of just criticizing. This person is this, that person is that, this group is this. No, bring in an alternative. Instead of cursing the dark, light a candle. light a candle, bring in light, change the situation. If you think there's no good Islamic schools, go ahead and make one. If you think that the masajid are just unmosquing people, well, go ahead, go into the masjid and start bringing people into the masjid. If you think that the masajid are just not putting in ilm, go ahead, start bringing in the ulama and start putting in ilm. If you think the masajid are just being too misogynist, well, go ahead, invite the sisters in and start bringing and making those sisters feel welcome. Instead of cursing the dark, go ahead, light a candle. That's the most thing that Ummah needs right now. Allah al-Musta'an. We'll actually stop right here. I know, I guess I kind of got carried away and I was really hoping to finish all of this. But inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. And yeah.
Oh man, it's over already?
I know, exactly. I was really hoping to finish. I was really hoping to finish all of this today and even tomorrow, but inshallah, that's all right. It's important. Look at this one, in where the Prophet ﷺ was even, let's say, al-Mu'mineen, okay? al-Mu'mineen was telling his Sayyid, al-Mu'mineen, sorry. Sayyida Aisha was actually telling one guy who was giving maw'adha in a reminder. She said, Ya Ubayd ibn Amr, إذا وعظت فأوجز فإن كثير الكلام ينسي بعضه بعضا. She said, Ubayd, if you give a maw'adha, make it short, because too much or too many words would make the other words become forgotten. So maybe a lesson for us to learn. So
it's just so amazing how the Prophet ﷺ, he would say such short words, like the sentences,
Absolutely.
But they had such big meaning.
Absolutely. Well, we can't be like the Prophet ﷺ. So yep. So look at this. Such a small sentence, end of the story, but such eloquent words. And you can give all these. Look at this ayah. خذ العفو وأمر بالعرف وأعرض عن الجاهلين. End of the story. This is amazing. All right. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, even though we're still not done. But yeah. And you can unmute yourselves, by the way.
Should we keep recording or?
Well, I mean.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll stop it.